The former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, was sentenced tonight to over 27 years in prison after a Supreme Court judgment earlier today. Bolsonaro, who was president from 2019 to 2022, was found guilty of attempting to use military force to overturn an election and plotting to assassinate a political rival, the man who holds the presidency now, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. His trial had already led to a confrontation between Brazil's current government and the Trump administration, which could now expand. Here's our Nick Schifrin.
In Brazil's Supreme Court today, a historic conviction. Jair Bolsonaro, the former army captain who became Brazil's first modern right-wing president, guilty of trying to, quote, abolish democracy, and guilty of a coup and assassination attempt on current President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, who won the 22 election over Bolsonaro by less than 1%. Guilty verdicts detail an extensive attempt to overturn the will of the people.
The guilty verdicts detail an extensive attempt to overturn the will of the people. 有罪判决详细揭示了一场试图推翻人民意志的大规模行动。
The culmination, Bolsonaro incited supporters to storm the seat of government and vandalize the presidential palace just days after Lula, as he's universally known, took office.
De que grupo liderado por Jair Messias Bolsonaro,
a group led by Jair Messias Bolsonaro, composed of key figures from
A group led by Jair Messias Bolsonaro, composed of key figures from the government. 一个由雅伊尔·博西亚斯·博索纳罗领导的，包含政府核心人物的团体。
from the government, the armed forces, and intelligence agencies, developed and implemented
The armed forces and intelligence agencies developed and implemented. The armed forces and intelligence agencies developed and implemented. 武装部队和情报机构制定并实施了
a progressive and systematic plan to attack democratic institutions.
a progressive and systematic plan to attack democratic institutions. 一项逐步推进且有系统的旨在攻击民主制度的计划。
with the aim of undermining the legitimate transfer of power in the 2022 election.
With the aim of undermining the legitimate transfer of power in the 2022 elections. 其目的是破坏2022年选举中的合法权力交接。
Bolsonaro's critics call today a victory for Brazil's rule of law.
Bolsonaro's critics call today a victory for Brazil's rule of law. 博索纳罗的批评者称今天是巴西法治的胜利。
A reaffirmation of the 1980s Constitution created to end 2 decades of dictatorship.
A reaffirmation of the 1980s Constitution created to end 2 decades of dictatorship. 对为结束20年独裁统治而制定的20世纪80年代宪法的重申 A reaffirmation of the 1980s Constitution created to end 2 decades of dictatorship.
But Bolsonaro's supporters, and there are many, call his prosecution political.
But Bolsonaro's supporters, and there are many, call his prosecution political. 博索纳罗的许多支持者们称，对他的起诉具有政治性。
And they vow to keep up their protests, including
And they vow to keep up their protests. 并且他们誓言将继续抗议。
Bolsonaro's likely conservative successor, Sao Paulo's governor.
We cannot destroy democracy under the pretext of rescuing it.
We cannot destroy democracy under the pretext of rescuing it. 我们不能以拯救民主为借口来摧毁民主。
We also cannot tolerate a conviction without proof.
Tolerate a conviction without proof. 容忍没有证据的定罪。
A conviction without proof opens a wound that will never heal.
Bolsonaro's supporters have found a kindred spirit in President Trump.
Bolsonaro's supporters have found a kindred spirit in President Trump. 博索纳罗的支持者在特朗普总统身上找到了志同道合的人。What's the meaning of kindred? Kindred 的含义是有血缘关系的、同类的、志同道合的。
Who sanctioned the justice overseeing Bolsonaro's case using laws usually reserved for human rights abuses.
Who sanctioned the justice oversees Bolsonaro's case using laws usually reserved for human rights. Translate into Chinese. Who sanctioned the justice oversees Bolsonaro's case using laws usually reserved for human rights. 将我下面的英文翻译成中文。Who sanctioned the justice overseeing Bolsonaro's case using laws usually reserved for human rights? 运用通常专门用于人权领域的法律，对负责审理博索纳罗案件的法官实施了制裁。
Abuses. President Trump also raised tariffs on Brazil to 50% and today praised Bolsonaro.
I think it's a terrible thing. Very terrible. I think it's very bad for Brazil.
But President Trump's intervention failed to prevent today's verdict or convince Lula to drop his defiance.
Failed to prevent today's verdict or convince Lula to drop his defiance. 未能阻止今日的判决，也未能说服卢拉放弃反抗。
Não somos e não seremos novamente colônia de ninguém.
We are not, and we will never again be anyone's colony.
Be anyone's colony. 不做任何人的殖民地。
We are capable of governing and caring for our land and our people without interference from any foreign government.
Tonight, Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned the U.S. will, quote, respond accordingly to this witch hunt. For a deeper look, we turn to Brian Winter, the Executive Vice President of the Americas Society and Councils of the Americas, nonprofit groups that seek to foster greater understanding throughout the Western Hemisphere.
Seek to foster greater understanding throughout the Western Hemisphere. 努力在整个西半球促进更深层次的理解。
Brian Winter, thanks very much. Welcome to the News Hour. Brazil's a young democracy, no stranger to coups and dictatorships. How significant is it that Bolsonaro has become the first former president to be convicted of plotting to overthrow an election?
Be convicted of plotting to overthrow an election. 被判犯有密谋推翻选举结果罪。
It's a big day. It's a historic day for Brazil for the reasons that you cite. It's a country that just recovered its democracy a little more than 40 years ago, therefore is especially sensitive to any kind of risk of losing it. This is also a big day for the relationship between Brazil and the United States, because as your program just noted, we do expect there to be some sort of response from the Trump White House, which has described this whole process, this whole trial against former President Bolsonaro, his ally, as a witch hunt.
Before I get to the U.S. and President Trump, 27 years is the sentence that just came down in the last few minutes. Very significant, but does that mean that Jair Bolsonaro will spend the next 27 years in prison?
I think there's good reason to doubt that. There's a somewhat overused expression about Brazil, which is that it's not for beginners.
There's a somewhat overused expression about Brazil, which is that it's not for beginners. 关于巴西，有一句用的有些泛滥的说法：巴西不适合新手。
And this is a country where, what seems like finality rarely is.
This is a country where what seems like finality really is. 这是一个看似已成定局的事情就真的不可改变的国家。
And as proof of that, of course, the current president, President Lula, was also sentenced to jail back in 2018 on corruption charges. He ended up serving about 2 years, was then released, and is now president of Brazil. So if you get into the business of making too many predictions, you're likely to make a mistake. And look, it's clear that between 30, 35%, 40% of the country, pretty hardcore Bolsonaro supporters who are likely to vote for whoever the candidate will be in next year's election, whether that's a member of the Bolsonaro family or perhaps another candidate, such as the current governor of Sao Paulo.
As you just indicated, Brazil is deeply polarized. How will Bolsonaro's conviction and the sentence resonate through society?
How will Bolsonaro's conviction and the sentence resonate through society? Translate into Chinese. 博索纳罗的定罪及判决对巴西社会产生 How will Bolsonaro's conviction and the sentence resonate through the society? Translate it into Chinese. 博索纳罗的定罪和判决 conviction and the sentence 对社会产生怎样的影响 Resonate, what's the meaning? 产生共鸣，引起反响。
That's a good question. I think we're going to see that now. I mean, I'm an American. I lived in Brazil for many years. I follow the country closely. The parallels between our countries over the last 10 years or so have sometimes been bizarre.
Bizarre, B-I-Z-A-R-R-E, bizarre. 奇异的、怪诞的、离奇的。
And just as there was a period where it seemed like President Trump was on the outs after he left office in 2021 and he wasn't polling well, Bolsonaro has gone through, I think, a phase where his supporters have been feeling somewhat dejected.
A phase where his supporters have been feeling somewhat dejected. somewhat dejected, 有些沮丧。
And we'll see now if, with this trial and perhaps images eventually of President Bolsonaro being led away to prison after his appeals are rejected, if he fails to get house arrest, which I know his lawyers are pushing for, that may reanimate the Bolsonaro base.
That may reanimate the Bolsonaro base. 重新激活博索纳罗的支持阵营。
In the same way that some of the trials against President Trump reanimated Republican supporters who appeared ready at one point to sort of, look toward other candidates.
But there is clearly a version of Bolsonaro's movement that will follow Bolsonaro after, whether he's in prison or in house arrest?
Well, it's a country that has become more conservative over the last 10, 20 years. Nobody contests that.
Nobody contests that. Nobody contests that. 没有人能对此提出异议。
It's a country where, for example, evangelical Christians have gone from being about 8% of the population in a largely Roman Catholic country in the 1980s to about 27% of the population today. That is part of the reason why Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. And, it's a 50-50 country in some ways. The last election was literally 51-49 and Lula won. But it's a country where, a lot of the same issues of gun rights and so-called gender ideology and abortion and other topics are really animating people. And
Other topics are really animating people. 其他话题确实让人们情绪高涨。
That's one of the reasons why President Trump and his allies have latched onto this case and have
President Trump and his allies have latched on to this case. Latched on to this case. 介入这个案件。
have felt such a kinship with President Bolsonaro.
Kinship with President Bolsonaro. 与博索纳罗总统的亲属关系、亲切感。
Is because they do see these similarities. There's people like Steve Bannon who go back and forth between both movements, Jason Miller, who's another member of President Trump's orbit. And so, again, I don't always like to say that what happens in Brazil is because of what's happening in the US, but there have been a lot of parallels over the last 10 years or so.
But there have been a lot of parallels over the last 10 years also. 但在过去10年左右时间里，出现了很多相似之处。
So quickly, in the last 45 seconds or so we have left, let's come back to U.S. policy, as you called it, a kinship between President Trump and Bolsonaro. Tonight, President Trump, as we saw, criticized the conviction. Secretary of State Rubio vowing that the U.S. would respond. The U.S. already has imposed sanctions on the judge overseeing this case. If we were to see more sanctions like that, what would be the response?
Well, Brazil is not the only country in the world that has faced U.S. sanctions, but it is the only country in the world where those sanctions have been linked to a judicial process. So far, this 50% tariff has not changed the mind of the courts. In fact, it may have even solidified their will.
It may have even solidified their willpower. 这甚至可能坚定了他们的意志力。
Power, but we'll see. I mean, people in Brazil are worried about what President Trump might do next, and that'll be the next chapter in this story.
Ryan Winter, thank you very much.
Thank you.